I'd like to join Darren in thanking Linda Bryan for her support of this and lots of other things we do here at Baylor. And I'd like to thank Darren and his whole team for their exemplary leadership and work putting together this conference and sponsoring so many things that make us return and focus more attentively on the sort of questions that universities ought to be about, but as we all know, too often aren't. Someone who will certainly help us to focus on those questions is tonight's speaker. It says something about him that it's his second time here at Baylor. He was here in the spring to give the honors convocation speech, that both times he's spoken, he's been in this room at this podium. That's pretty impressive. We hope he can keep that streak going in further returns. I was given by Darren's office a CV for Patrick, a lot of which I didn't know because it's 18 pages long in very small font. And I went in search of a bit more livelier sort of narrative, and wasn't surprised that I found one on the Front Porch Republic site describing Patrick, whom I've known for a number of years, but I'm going to read a little bit from that. Patrick Deneen teaches political theory at the University of Notre Dame. His move to Notre Dame from Georgetown just this fall was to me a sign of hope that hasn't been seen at Notre Dame since Lou Holtz's arrival. And the football team's winning. So, good job. Before that, he taught at Georgetown University, where he's the founding director of the Tocqueville Forum on the Roots of American Democracy, and before that, he taught at Princeton University. He received both his BA and PhD from Rutgers, where he studied with and drank bourbon in the company of the late, great Wilson Carey McWilliams, who was indeed a great man. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at Boston College a number of years ago. A great man that he worked with there at Rutgers. Grew up in Windsor, Connecticut, which at that time was a vibrant town with a town green, St. Gabriel's Church, where Patrick was imperfectly catechized, and locally owned businesses, including a 99-cent movie theater, the Plaza, where many hours of his youth were whiled away. The town green and St. Gabriel's Church are both still there, but getting emptier every year. The Plaza has long since been shuttered up like countless other movie theaters that once beckoned on our main streets. We note the tone and genre of lament here that characterizes a good bit of Patrick's own writing. He's the author of 2 books, The Odyssey of Political Theory and Democratic Faith. He's the co-editor of 2 collections of essays by Wilson Carey McWilliams. He's also the author of a number of articles. I think I quit counting at about the number of 40 articles that he's published in scholarly journals and books on ancient political theory, American political thought, as well as the areas of religion, politics, literature. He's at work currently on 2 books, one on the American Dream and the other entitled Vocation, the Division of Labor in Western Thought. I've had the pleasure of interacting on a number of occasions with Patrick, but the time that I learned the most about him as a thinker and a teacher was when I was fortunate enough to be hosted by him for a seminar on film and politics at Georgetown a couple years ago. And I got to spend a couple days with a group of his graduate students, and they weren't exactly disciples, although I think late one night a couple of them did a pretty good imitation of Patrick, but they were certainly some of the most intellectually alive and serious and enjoyable students I've ever had the occasion to be with, and they were all brought together, their friendships created in Patrick's classes. That's high testimony to him as a teacher and as a thinker, and we're honored to have him here tonight to speak to us on the culture of technology, how who we are shapes what we make. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Deneen.
Thanks so much, my friend Tom Hibbs. It's such a delight to be back here on this podium again, and I want to thank Darren Davis. I can't say enough about what he has done. Just dealing with me, sending personally sending me countless emails trying to track me down in the midst of a move. It's not every director of a program that's actually sort of personally doing all these things. And I guess you're probably sweeping up the room afterwards, but he's done just a tremendous job, and clearly in just being deeply engaged in putting this program together. The Institute for Faith and Learning, I've just been so impressed to come to learn more about it. And now that I know about the gift of the Bryan family, thank you as well for allowing me to be here tonight. I want to speak on the relationship in many ways of culture and technology, but I want to start with a basic acknowledgement that ought to at least be in our minds as this weekend unfolds, which is that human beings have always been technological creatures. I think that at times we tend to think that we're now in a particularly we're at this kind of unique moment of being technological creatures. But humans have always been technological creatures. We've always been creatures that use techne, to use that word that Darren used, craft or art, to fashion objects that nature does not itself make. And this fact has been recognized and memorialized in some of our most ancient stories, ancient mythology, poetry, and song. The myth of Prometheus is perhaps the most penetrating recognition of this fact. Humanity, as was created in that myth, was created without any particular weapons or defenses. You know that story in which Prometheus decides to take a coffee break and leaves the job of shaping the rest of the creatures to Epimetheus, his brother, Afterthought. If you have a brother named Afterthought, don't let him take over the job, because he proceeds then to give all of the various talents and gifts and attributes to all the creatures before he's finished making all the creatures, and he's left then with this one creature, humanity, that he's run out of the bag of tricks. And so this creature is allowed just to go out into the world, and without any particular natural weapons or natural defenses, without even fur to protect us from the elements, this creature was on the verge of going extinct before Prometheus takes pity upon us and is moved to steal fire from the citadel of the gods and give to humanity this divine gift. And only then by the means of the tools and the objects that could be made from this harnessing of fire was humanity not only able to survive, but to become the dominant species on the planet, its most godlike creature. And yet that gift also, we're told in various versions of this myth, made us the enemy of the gods, suspect for our hubris and our overweening ambition, that very godliness that we seem to possess. And so was informed by the suspicion that our very technological nature was double-edged, at once a blessing and a curse. This is in the oldest stories that we have about ourselves as techne-making creatures. So while praises and misgivings about our technological nature have been present perhaps as long as humans have told stories about themselves, it is in modern times, since perhaps roughly since the dawn of the industrial era, that we have entered what some have called the technological age. So while we continue, as we have always been, to be technological creatures, our nature, or the nature of our use and reliance upon technology has in many ways distinctively changed. And with it, the nature of our attitude toward and our relationship with technology. One is hard-pressed to think of works of poetry or literature or song that express society-wide ecstasy as well as a deep-seated anxiety over technology in pre-modern times. No great works in the Middle Ages that extol or lament the invention of the iron stirrup or the horse collar. Maybe those epics will be found someday, but to my knowledge, they don't exist. So a defining mark of the modern age is not simply the nature of our technology, and I'm sure a lot will be said this weekend about that, but our relationship to that technology, how we feel about it, what we think about it, having an entire conference devoted to it, ushering in then an age in which one finds both wild optimism about the prospects for human perfectibility through progress, as well as a corresponding profound terror about the possibility of an impending apocalypse that the same technology might usher in. It's this genre and this oscillation between ecstasy and anxiety over technology's role in our lives and our collective fate that has become one of the primary forms of self-expression and a really distinctive form of the modern age. At least we could date that to Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein at the very beginning of the industrial age, if not before. And in recent years, this genre seems to have become all the more ubiquitous, with a special emphasis not only upon technology's promise or threat, but technology's role in either preventing or bringing about the apocalypse, the cessation of human life. Films and shows, not to mention poems and song about the apocalypse have been popular since at least the book of Revelation. And they've been around since the very dawn of time. But my very unscientific impression seems to be that there's more and more popular programming than ever that's devoted to tales or reflections on the end times and the post-apocalypse. Even as it seems that the actual threat of nuclear annihilation, which for a period of time seemed to be imminent and our destruction momentary, even if that actual threat seems to have waned somewhat, we have found other forms of the night terrors, from medical catastrophe to cyborg warfare on humanity, to cyber warfare, and even an astonishing fascination and rise of the fear of zombies. I'm not sure if that's technological, but I thought I'd throw it in. Over the last few decades, it seemed that a sizable number of blockbuster films emphasized that the human apocalypse was imagined to be the result of a set of uncontrollable forces that humans valiantly and often successfully, or at least partially, combated. Such films include Extinction by Asteroid. In films, I see all these students here, so I don't know if these are so old that you don't remember these. Armageddon, Deep Impact, Alien Invasion, like Independence Day, or War of the Worlds, the Spielberg remake, or Battle of Los Angeles, or the general demise coincident with the Mayan calendar, 2012. What's noteworthy about these popular films is that it is technology in its various forms that proves to be the source of humanity's eventual triumph, or at least partial salvation from these threats. But again, in my unscientific survey of this genre, it seems to me that a sizable number of these kinds of programs or films, and a preponderance of recent entrants to this genre, seem to focus on how our own technology is actually likely to be the source of our doom. There are recent films that harken back to fears of the nuclear apocalypse, such as The Book of Eli or The Road, the Coleman McCarthy novel made into a movie. There are updates of this idea that we will cause our demise through global warming, such as The Day After Tomorrow. There are films about medical experiments gone awry, leading to massive die-off, such as I Am Legend, or Quarantine, or Contagion, or The Rise of the Planet of the Apes. There are shows about our technology failing or attacking us, the Terminator series of movies, and more recently the television show Revolution, about a time when all machines cease to operate and electricity ceases to flow. And more recently I discovered a digital series available only online to show its technological cutting-edgeness, entitled H+, Humanity Plus. You can all Google it right now. It was just released over the summer, and it tells of a future in which developments in nanotechnology leads to the widespread embrace of the implantation of computer technology, chips, into human beings, allowing us to discard our cell phones, our tablets, our computers, and becoming ourselves the receivers of the internet, senders, and so we just scroll in front of our eyes. It's kind of cool. While the series begins with pronouncements of triumphalism by transhumanist techno-optimists, an undercurrent of dread soon becomes dominant as this technology turns deadly and results in a massive die-off of the millions who have been implanted with this technology. So this preponderance of much of this recent genre seems to reflect a widespread foreboding about a shared sense of powerless and even the potential for a new kind of bondage to the very technology that is supposed to be the source of our flourishing. These movies and programs portray how, in our optimistic and even hubristic belief that our technology will usher in a new age of freedom, we discover in various ways that we are subjects of that technology. Far from controlling or using our technology for our own betterment, our technology ends up either ruling or destroying us, leading to an unintended but profound catastrophe. Now, a host of more academic studies and works present an additional, if less dramatic, set of sources that explore the ways that we are subjects to the transformative effects of our technology. And I could point you to page 2, the inside cover of your program from this conference, right? What does it say? Technology changes us. All right, so that's one piece of evidence. A paramount example is to be found today in anxious descriptions of how the internet and the social media are inescapably changing us, and mainly, in the view of many of these authors, for the worse. A series of recent books and studies, many of which can be found on the tables out here, have found a ready audience that goes well beyond the academic marketplace. For instance, a book I saw out there today, the widely discussed recent book by Nicholas Carr entitled The Shallows, describes how the internet is literally changing us, transforming our brains into organs that are different than those that existed in the pre-internet world. His study explores the way that persistent exposure to and occupation with the internet is leading to physiological changes in the makeup of our brains, and hence to the ways that we think and learn and act in the world. Appealing to developments and studies in brain plasticity, Carr argues that sustained exposure to the internet is literally rewiring our synapses, making us intensely hungry for frequent changes of images and content, and less able than our forebears to concentrate and focus. So these fellows here who are kind of sitting there with their iPads and computers, these people have had their brains reshaped by the internet because they can't stay off their devices. You students have been really good so far. You haven't been grabbing your cell phones. But, these folks, I'm a little worried about them. For Carr, this is not altogether a change for the worse, since these changes have also been shown to result in measurable increases in some areas, particularly decision-making and problem-solving. However, these gains have also been accompanied by significant losses in facility with language and memory and concentration. We are, he argues, becoming more shallow, not simply superficially, but physiologically. The internet is making us dumber. And this is also the subject of a book in a different way by a professor of English, Mark Bauerlein, at Emory University, called The Dumbest Generation. Other books in this genre emphasize how the internet and the social media contribute to changes in our social and relational lives in ways, again, often for the worse. Just the other day, NPR ran yet another in a series of stories that it's run or interviews that it's had with a recent author or about a recent book by this author lamenting the baleful effects of the internet in our social lives. In this interview, Terry Gross of the NPR program Fresh Air interviewed Sherry Turkle, again, whose book is available outside. I'm not getting any money for hawking these books. Sherry Turkle, who is a clinical psychologist and the founding director of MIT's Initiative on Technology and the Self, and the author of the book entitled Alone Together. In that book, as this title suggests, Turkle worries and offers and accumulates evidence to show that our use of modern social media not so much creates new community as it takes the place of communities that are undermined or even destroyed through its pervasive use. She reminds us that the word community means literally to give among each other, and argues that such a practice requires, as she puts it, physical proximity and shared responsibilities. The growing presence of social media fosters relationships that avoid either of these constitutive elements of community. replacing that thicker and shared set of practices that come to exist in a community, instead with thinner and more evanescent bonds that she calls networks. Now, Turkle is not simply a rosy-eyed nostalgic. She acknowledges the difficult and even awful aspects of community as they have existed in human history. She tells of the community her grandparents lived in, one that was rife with deep antagonisms. But she also insists that it was the very thickness of those relations that gave rise, on the one hand, to such contentious relations that also inspired people to take care of each other in time of need. Turkle fears that we are losing not only the experience of that set of thicker bonds, but the capacity to form such thick bonds that form and constitute these kinds of communities. The social media become a kind of ersatz, a substitute in the place of that which has declined. It fills a void that it itself has created. These recent works follow in the path blazed by a fairly long, at least half-century tradition established by critics of technology who emphasize the ways that technology changes us and particularly destroys long-standing ways of life, a collection of practices, traditions, and beliefs, what we might broadly call culture. A number of these thinkers I saw appearing as subjects on various panels of this program. Jacques Ellul, whose book, The Technological Society, emphasizes the way that technique erases everything in its path in the name of utility and efficiency. Or Wendell Berry, whose a panel is devoted to tomorrow, whose writings have argued that machine technology in particular has its own logic, one that tends to destroy the practices and traditions of a community built up over a long period of time. But to my mind, one of the most representative voices of this tradition is someone else whose book I saw outside, Neil Postman, whose book Technopoly, published 20 years ago in 1992, was suggestively subtitled The Surrender of Culture to Technology. In that book, Postman described the rise of what he called technocracy in the modern era. Pre-industrial forms of culture and social organization, as I began my lecture suggesting, use tools no less often than technocratic societies do. But the tools employed in these cultures, Postman argued, and I quote, did not attack, or more precisely, were not intended to attack the dignity and integrity of the culture into which they were introduced. With some exceptions, tools did not prevent people from believing in their traditions, in their God, in their politics, in their methods of education, or in the legitimacy of their social organization, end quote. In technocracy, he argued, by contrast, the tools adopted serve constantly to transform an entire way of life by undermining our culture or a cultural tradition. And so Postman argues, and I quote again, everything must give way in some degree to their development. Tools are not integrated into the culture. They attack the culture. They bid to become the culture. As a consequence, tradition, social mores, myth, politics, ritual, and religion have to fight for their lives. And from technocracy, he argues, we have now entered an age of technopoly in which a culturally flattened world now operates under a single ideology of progress, one that leads, he writes, to the submission of all forms of cultural life to the sovereignty of technique and of technology. Those residual forms of cultural practices that persisted even in the era of technocracy now give way to a transformed world in which technology itself is our culture, or perhaps better put, a kind of anti-culture, a tradition-destroying and custom-undermining dynamic that takes the place of cultural practices, of memory, of beliefs. What these critiques, from the films to these academic studies, have in common, and in keeping with the very theme of this conference, what these have in common is the supposition that our technology is changing us, whether for better or for worse. We are the subjects of its activity upon us, and we are largely powerless before its transformative power. Thus, in addition to the animating fear that arises from the suspicion or the conviction that technology may be changing us for the worse, is that accompanying fear of our powerlessness in the path of what has been described as technological inevitability. Perhaps an even deeper source of the anxiety that we see expressed both in popular culture and in these academic works is that there's a kind of inevitability to technological advances over which we exercise little to no control. There's a kind of Hegelian or Darwinian narrative about humanity's technology that has come to dominate the worldview of many of these either cultural or intellectual sources, in which we either are creating our own destroyer or our own salvation, but over which we do not exercise ultimate control. Our awareness of these dangers, then, is akin to that of Cassandra, who, seeing the future, nevertheless knows that there's nothing that can be done about her prophecy. Our popular culture, then, seems to be a kind of electronic Cassandra, offering entertaining forms of prophecy born of our own anxieties. We take a kind of perverse pleasure in distracting ourselves in portrayals of our powerlessness. Again, there is a genre of scholarship that has been devoted to exploring the question of a kind of immutable historical inevitability to technological development, often populated by voices that laud or embrace this narrative of inevitability. In recent years, this argument was made, among others, by Francis Fukuyama in an article and then a book entitled The End of History, in which he argued that the necessity of military development and technological development for military ends contributed ultimately to the inevitable rise of the liberal state that provided the kind of venue, the open venue for that kind of scientific exploration and discovery. Other works speak to forms of technological inevitability as a result of forces that are embedded somehow in the nature of reality or history itself. In a now classic 1967 essay, Do Machines Make History?, the economic historian Robert Heilbronner depicted a certain logic within human history itself that pushed humans toward a certain path or logic of technological development. While societies might adopt technologies at different points or at different speeds, he nevertheless claimed that there was what he called a kind of soft determinism in technological development. Right? Things tended to be discovered all around the same time, in different places, and in the same basic order. Perhaps more forthright still was an argument to be found in Daniel J. Borstein's short book, The Republic of Technology, written in 1978, in which he depicted technological development as following a kind of law, a law like gravity or thermodynamics, writing, for example, that, and I quote, "The supreme law of the Republic of Technology is convergence, a tendency for everything to become more like everything else." That is, the laws that govern technological development will inevitably create a world in its own image, shaping our human world in an increasingly identical form, anticipating, even in 1978, that modern technology's child, what sometimes we call now globalization, is in fact a kind of process, a kind of unfolding. This narrative, then, of inevitability, whether of praise or lament, tends to give an autonomous role to technology itself, as if its advances occur independently of human intention. It becomes a process driven by an internal logic and an inescapable set of developments. It is, to modify a phrase of Hegel, the cunning of techne, the unconscious unfolding of a technological Geist that leads inevitably to convergence and to singularity, a fully technologized culmination of history with a capital H. It too, perhaps, has a slaughter bench that demands its share of victims in the course of this unfolding, but progress is the justification for their sacrifice, progress to a better and even perfected future. It is then these two related ways that modern humans have come to discern and to portray technology as something that shapes or even remakes us, and that does so with a kind of iron law of inevitability. And it's these two ways of thinking about technology that I want to challenge, or at least complicate, during the rest of my talk. But to do so requires us to step into my wheelhouse and to explore what Aristotle called the master science even of technology, political philosophy, and to show the deeper and even hidden origins of humanity's new relationship to technology and of our attendant techno-optimism or our techno-pessimism. If what I've been describing is the human relationship or reaction, in particular to technology and modernity, what then is modernity? Well, modernity, as any of you have taken a class or talked about this word, while it is many things and highly debated, or whether it even exists, perhaps above all, I would contend, it consists of a new definition of liberty. In the ancient world, whether pre-Christian antiquity, particularly ancient Greece and the philosophy of ancient Greece, or during the long reign of Christendom, the dominant definition of liberty involved recognition that the true form of liberty consisted in the appropriate form of self-governance. This conception of liberty stretched between and was based upon a reciprocal relationship between self-government of individuals over themselves that was fostered through the cultivation of virtue, whether the ancient or Christian conceptions of virtue, which are not the same, and self-government as was achieved in polities, in which the governing aspiration was the achievement of the common good. Ancient thought struggled with how it was that one could bring into existence a kind of virtuous circle. A virtuous circle in which polities would support the fostering of virtuous individuals on the one hand, and virtuous individuals would form the civic life of a polity oriented toward the common good. And so much of the challenge of ancient theory, of ancient philosophy, ancient political thought, was how to start such a virtuous circle where it did not exist or existed only partially, and how to maintain it when the predominant view of history was the likelihood of corruption, of decline. Liberty then, by this understanding, by the ancient understanding, was not to do as one wished, but rather to choose the right, the virtuous course, the course of good. To be free was above all to be free from the enslavement to one's own basest desires. Desires that could never be fulfilled. They had no end. They were simply always more, their appetites without end. Liberty was thus the condition of achieving self-rule over one's own appetites, as well as over the longing for dominion and power in the political realm. The defining feature of modern political thought was the rejection of this definition and understanding of liberty in favor of one that is more familiar to us today. Liberty, as first defined by the originators of modern liberalism, the worldview and regime in which we now live, namely the proto-liberal philosopher Thomas Hobbes and the full-bore liberal philosopher John Locke, liberty was to be found in the condition in which humans were completely free to pursue whatever they desired. That was the state of freedom. It was called the state of nature, and that's where liberty was to be found. It was a condition before law, before society, before governments. It was a condition in which one pursued what one wanted. Its opposite was thus conceived of as constraint, and not, as the ancients held, one in which liberty was the condition of just and appropriate self-rule. At the same time, these thinkers recognized that the state of nature was an unbearable condition. This true form of liberty, as they thought, was insecure, leading to lives that were nasty, brutish, poor, solitary, and short, in Hobbes's words, or more mildly in Locke's view, a state of inconveniences. Law and politics were devised as a kind of second-best option, ones that existed, however, to make possible a more reliable condition of modern liberty. Government was conceived as the route to securing the natural rights of individuals. This is the very language used in our Declaration of Independence. Governments are instituted to secure our rights. That is, our capacity to act in pursuit of our own individually defined ends. Two great obstacles then existed in the pursuit of securing a more stable and predictable form of modern liberty. The first was nature itself. Nature everywhere has been an obstacle to the realization of our true wants and our most fervent desires. Among other things, nature will kill you. But that's not the only way that it will prevent you from getting what you want. The second obstacle is other people who, pursuing their own desires, are apt to get in one's way or to even to seek the limit of the achievement of our own desires. Out of the effort to tame these two limits upon the modern exercise of liberty, modern thinkers recommended two solutions: a new science of science, what we now today call applied science or technology, and a new science of politics, namely the modern liberal regime. Together, they combine to create our technological age. This new science of science was philosophically inaugurated by Thomas Hobbes's one-time employer, Francis Bacon. Bacon rejected the ancient form of science that was considered at one point to be a branch of philosophy, once called natural philosophy, and was concerned above all with understanding the natural order as an avenue to understanding the entirety of the created and divine order. Bacon instead commended a new form of science that would seek not only to understand the operations of nature, but through that understanding to seek to find ways to exert human control over nature's objects and forces, and to contribute to the project that he described as the relief of the human estate. Modern liberty, according to Bacon, that is the desire to pursue our own ends as we see fit, is thus secured and enlarged through the increase of human power through the form of dominion and the scientific dominion over nature, a condition that called for the cessation of old commendations of virtue and of self-governance in favor of the harnessing of nature in the supplying of the fulfillment of our desires. Thus, Francis Bacon famously coined the phrase, knowledge is power, the power to achieve the ends that we want. The second obstacle to be overcome was limits upon our liberty by other people. Now, the very increase of power to be achieved through modern applied science promised to increase the overall opportunity to achieve individual ends. But an overarching change of the political order was necessary to make possible this pursuit. The old political orders, previously devoted to the inculcation of virtue and the commendation of the common good, lacked the motivating power to liberate us to pursue our desires. It was attacked early on by, among others, Niccolò Machiavelli, who in The Prince described the old way of thinking as so many imaginary republics and principalities. That the ancient thinkers were dealing in oughts rather than taking humanity as they really are. In order to unleash the productive and scientific capacity of human beings, a different mode and order needed to be introduced, a completely new form of political technology that made possible the creation of a technological society. That form of political technology was the modern republic, posited upon rejection of key premises of ancient republicanism, and rested upon the commendation of the harnessing of self-interest in both the public and in the private realm in order to secure prospects for human liberty, to increase the scope, the scale, and the extent of human power and dominion over nature. The precondition of our technological society was thus that great achievement of political technology, the applied technology of liberal theory, our Constitution. The Constitution is the embodiment of a certain set of modern principles that sought to overturn ancient teachings and instead shape a distinctly modern human being. It is a kind of precursor technology, the precondition for our technological age. According to James Madison, who argued famously in Federalist 10, the first aim of government is the protection of the diverse faculties of men, which is to say, our capacity and opportunity to pursue our individual aims and ends, and to protect the outcomes of those pursuits, and in particular, differences in the attainment of property. Governments exist to protect the greatest possible sphere of individual liberty, and do so by encouraging the pursuit of self-interest among both the citizenry as well as our public servants. Ambition must be made to counter ambition, wrote Madison elsewhere in the Federalist Papers. That to separate and divide powers would prevent any particular person from centralizing and seizing power. But at the same time, government itself was to be given substantial new powers to directly act upon individuals in order to at once liberate them from constraints of their particular circumstances, their localities, their states, as well as to promote the expansion of commerce and, as is stated in the Constitution, the useful arts and sciences. This new political technology was designed to liberate us from the partial loyalties to particular people and particular places, to make us, above all, into individuals who would strive to achieve our individual aims, ambitions, and desires. Part of the new technology of modern republicanism is what Madison called an enlarged orbit, one that would increase individual prospects for our ambitions, while making our interpersonal ties and connections, our commitments, more tenuous, more fleeting, and more fungible. One of the ways it was hoped that the modern Republican model would combat the ancient problem of political faction, of caring too much and investing too much in the political sphere, was not by commending public spiritedness as the ancients once did, but rather what Madison called fostering a mistrust of motives among citizens, a mistrust that would come about due to the large expanse of the Republic, constantly changing political dynamics, the encouragement to pluralism, the expansion of diversity as a default preference, and thus shifting commitments of the citizenry. The ancient commendation of virtue and the aspiration to achieve a common good would be replaced by the basic motivation of modern republicanism, the pursuit of self-interest that leads to the increase of power and thus our capacity to fulfill our individual desires. Thus, a technological society comes into being by means of a new kind of political technology, one that commends self-interest, the unleashed ambition of individuals, an emphasis upon private pursuits over public weal, and an acquired ability to maintain psychic distance from any other human, including the capacity to reconsider any relationship that might constitute a fundamental limitation over our personal liberty. In light, then, of this set of political preconditions to a technological society that I've sketched out all too briefly here, although probably too long for your appetite, let me now try to reach a conclusion by reconsidering the two dominant narratives by which our relationship to technology tends to be portrayed and with which I began. That is, that technology shapes us in ways that should cause us regret and concern, and that it does so in ways that are inevitable. First, as I've tried to suggest and lay out, there is much concern about the ways that modern technology in particular undermines community, tends to make us more individualistic. But seen in the light of a deeper set of preconditions that existed before the creation of our technological society, we can see rather that technology supports the fundamental commitments that were articulated as the basic desiderata in early modern political philosophy, and given orientation by our founding piece of technology, our political technology, our modern Republican government, our constitutional order. It is less than a matter of our technology as we think of it making us or changing us, as much as it is how our deepest political commitments, often unbeknownst to us, shape our technology, especially as it supports the modern project of expanding modern liberty and permitting us to pursue our individual ends. You could say that our political technology is the operating system that creates the environment for the various technological programs that thrive in that operating system. But that operating system itself is the result of a philosophical transformation and definition and understanding of liberty. Consider, for example, the laments that we see about Facebook. I know there's some discussion of Facebook in this conference. In a recent Atlantic Monthly issue, there was an article entitled, "Is Facebook Making Us Lonely?" And as that title suggests, it leads with the suggestion that maybe this program, this social networking medium, is creating or fostering a kind of loneliness in the American polity, or in the American public. Its author, Stephen March, however, refreshingly avoids blaming phenomena like Facebook or the internet for what he sees as an epidemic of loneliness. Rather, he notes that Facebook and other forms of technology like it have rather facilitated and even enabled a pre-existing predilection, the long-standing American longing to be independent and free. Facebook is thus a tool in support of a goal that elicits from a deeper set of philosophical, political, and even theological commitments, a national proclivity to be lonely, or at least to keep others at arm's length. As March points out in this article, and I quote, "Loneliness is one of the first things that Americans spend their money achieving. We are lonely because we want to be lonely. We have made ourselves lonely. It is the byproduct of a long-standing national appetite for independence." Now, I could go on and offer many examples of how our technology supports this long-standing American value. The suburbs, not simply the result of the automobile, but in many ways, right, a creation of a way of life in which we have the impression or belief of our independence from others. How we build our houses. Right? I'm fond of an article published in the 1970s entitled "From Porch to Patio," that talks about a change in basic building technology in which we once had this intermediate sphere between the public and the private worlds of house and street, ceased to be a signature part of our architectural horizon and was replaced by the backyard patio. I could go on and offer continuing examples of this. Let me instead offer a counterexample, namely a society that relies no less on technology than our own, but which uses or even eschews technology of various kinds in support of highly distinct ends to that of our modern American society. That contrast is offered powerfully and doubtless too obviously by the Old World Amish, who are best known to us as those peculiar people who inexplicably eschew certain modern conveniences such as automobiles and zippers. Now, some of their decisions, like rejecting zippers, I'm not sure about. But what I do know is that the basic criterion that they use in the main to decide whether to adopt, or perhaps more importantly, how to adopt technology, things that they make, is driven by this question, whether this technology will or will not support the fabric of our community. It is believed that the automobile and electricity will not do so, though propane is accepted. But perhaps one of the most powerful examples of this criteria that is known to me is their decision to eschew a different kind of technology, but still one that we make: insurance. This is relevant since this has been a topic much in our news today in recent days. Our form of insurance is premised upon maximum capacity to maintain our anonymity and minimize personal commitments to one another. Our form of insurance is premised then, or is based upon the payment of premiums based upon the calculations of people in green eye shades, actuarial accountants, in which I join a pool with others seeking insurance for a variety of activities or objects, automobile, house, life, health, etc. When damage is experienced in one of these areas, I can turn then to the insurance company for some manner of compensatory payment to make me whole or partially whole again. Funds are drawn from the pool to which all of the insured have contributed. But all of us in that pool remain wholly unaware of how and to whom such payments are made. I am insured against a variety of tragedies, but I am personally off the hook for any personal responsibility or obligation beyond my payment of my premium to anyone else in the insurance pool. The Amish ban members of their community from purchasing such insurance. Rather, it is the community itself that is their insurance pool. That is their technology of insurance. They seek to foster a community in which the shared responsibility and obligation of every member of the community is to make someone who suffers a loss whole again, whether it's rebuilding someone's barn or caring for a family who has lost a parent or a child. As the economist Stephen Margolin writes in his wonderful study, The Dismal Science, How Thinking Like an Economist Undermines Community, the Amish, I'm quoting, perhaps unique in the 20th century America, in their attention to fostering community, forbid insurance precisely because they understand that the market relationship and individual and the insurance company undermines the mutual dependence of individuals. For the Amish, barn raisings are not exercises in nostalgia, but the cement that binds the community together. In our remaking of the world through those obvious technologies like the internet, but perhaps also in those less obvious but no less influential ones like the creation of suburban sprawl or our embrace of insurance or the way we have created a globe-spanning and anonymous market, we embrace and deploy technologies that make us how we already want or imagine ourselves wanting to be. And in a profound irony, it is precisely in this quest to attain a condition of ever more perfect individual liberty and autonomy that we increasingly conclude that we are in a condition of unfreedom, that we are dominated by our liberating technology. To secure our modern form of freedom through the great modern technology of the liberal political order and its capitalist system, there is the ceaseless need to expand power, to expand the empire of liberty. Concentrations of political and economic power are necessary or seen as necessary for the ever-increasing liberty of the individual. And this in contradiction to our contemporary political discourse that suggests that there is some kind of fundamental conflict between the individual and centralized power. Rather, we need to understand that the condition of an ever-expansive form of individual liberty is premised upon ever greater forms and exercises of concentrations of power. But that at the same time, those concentrations leave us with a sense of being powerless, of being voiceless, of being unheard. In our pursuit of ever more perfected forms and experiences of individual liberty, we find or perceive ourselves as being in a condition of profound unfreedom. This ultimate irony, this growing and pervasive belief that we no longer control the objects or the control of our technological world, is perhaps the result of that is the language, indeed, that we see defining this very conference, that we are shaped by our technologies, ones that we no longer choose, but rather that arise from a logic or dynamic that we no longer control, that are the result of a system over which we have only the faintest grasp or understanding. If our airwaves are increasingly punctuated by films about technological apocalypse, a good many of those also portray a shadowy and unknown and unknowable distant power that seems to pull the strings, even as we revel, perhaps falsely, in the belief in our independence and autonomy. Think, perhaps, best of all, of The Matrix, that quasi-Platonic film that put into image, into theatrical image, the suspicion of many of us that we are simply prisoners in a cave whose images are controlled by puppeteers, but which we all believe to be the substance of reality itself. So maybe the deepest irony of all is to be found that in our ever more realized experience of modern freedom, our capacity for true self-government wanes to the point of non-existence. In our current lamentations about a variety of crises, the civic crisis, we see it every night on the television, in which we seem to have lost the capacity to speak, much less act, according to the language of common good, and seem only to be able to acknowledge the existence of self-interest and greed, of our financial crisis, in which debt accrued for immediate satiation is thrust upon future generations in the vague hope that they will figure out a way to deal with those costs. That's up to you guys. In our environmental crisis, in which most of the answers to our problems are framed in terms of technological fixes. We'll invent an engine that will run on pixie dust, but which in reality ultimately requires us to place under command our ceaseless appetites. And in the moral crisis of a society in which personal commitments, perhaps above all commitments to families, so easily unravel in the belief of our right to individual autonomy and are replaced by therapy and social programs. In all these various crises, we fail to see the deep interconnection between them that arises from the very success of our project of pursuing modern liberty. We are certainly right, at least partly right, to congratulate ourselves for the many successes of our technology. But it seems to me we are also right, whether it's through our television and film programming or deeper ways of reflection, to worry about the deepest costs of our technological society, our culture of technology, that was premised from the very start upon a conception of liberty that was probably one that was not true, and one that seems to be leading us now ineluctably into a condition of bondage to the consequences of a belief in something that we perhaps ought not to have believed in the first place. I thank you for your attention. I'm told we can take some questions. We should have people go to the microphone. Is that? Ms. Hanson of the University of Dallas, known to me.
Hello. So I'm very sympathetic to your narrative, but I have a question about the American Constitution in context, right? So, I mean, I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea that you give of it being this kind of Hobbesian, Lockean replacement of an Aristotelian conception of the common good, but at the same time, a historian rather than a political philosopher, it seems that, in fact, most of people who came to the New World were fleeing regimes that had already replaced or given up the Aristotelian conception of the common good, and that although the American founders might have reached for whatever political philosophical weapons they had at hand in order to resist the extension of that replacement to the United States, they nevertheless were, in the kind of the actual dynamic of the American Revolution, was a revolution of resistance towards those developments of a kind of modern constitutionalism. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems to me that if one looks for Aristotle in let's say most regimes, perhaps even including, but certainly up to Aquinas, one would be hard-pressed to find Aristotelian regimes. I mean, yeah, even Aristotle is writing about this idealized version of the polis at a time when it's going out of existence. But I think you can find a set of fundamentally, let's say, or deeply informed set of principles that are Aristotelian, or modified form of Aristotelianism, essentially in a kind of the legacy of the Greek thinkers, and primarily in Christianity. All right? And if one wants to look for where one sees arguments for the cultivation of virtue and a commendation of the common good, one needs to look not for evidence of ancient virtue theory in the American colonial setting, although there was some of that, but primarily in the thought and in the arguments by many of its Christian voices at that time. I'm thinking, for example, although this is it's now being argued of whether or not this was widely known at the time when he delivered it, but in thinking about the example of the Amish eschewal of insurance as a way of cultivating a sense of common weal, one hears profound echoes, or perhaps what's the precursor of echoes of that understanding in the call by John Winthrop, the Congregationalist political and religious leader, in his famous model of Christian charity that he delivers aboard the ship Arbella as the Puritans are traveling, sailing to then the colonies. And he calls for precisely a kind of community in which its members would recognize themselves as fundamentally engaged in a work that is common, and in which a kind of form of self-sacrifice will define the nature of that community. I actually have the lines from this, which I skipped for the purpose of not going on for 4 hours, but he calls upon his fellow co-religionists to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. To this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. Remarkably, both Pauline as well as Aristotelian language, right? The language of this idea of the community as a kind of body in which we all have a role and a part and a place. So I think at the very outset of the American experiment, it's neither one thing or the other. You have this active debate that goes on, and especially in the period around the Revolution and after the Revolution, between this, let's say, inherited ancient tradition that was largely appeared through the conduit of Christianity, and the rationalist Enlightenment tradition, appealing back to Hobbes and to Locke. And while our political technology was in many ways an effort to bring these two together, and I think there are wonderful ways that the Declaration of Independence is a kind of a wonderful piece of rhetoric that tries to bring together people who may differ. Nevertheless, its dominant voice is that of the Lockean and Hobbesian Enlightenment, right? Even down to the phrase that among our rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, most students, you should all know this, Locke doesn't say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? What does he say? You know this? Life, liberty, and property, right? So the suspicion is, well, Jefferson didn't want to put property in there because he didn't want to give us a right to property. Of course Jefferson wanted to give us a right to property. But the pursuit of happiness was a wonderful phrase that's also from Locke. Do you know where it occurs? It's in his essay concerning human understanding in chapter 11, Of Power. And the pursuit of happiness is that constant desire to attain more. And once attaining it, realizing that you have something else you want to attain. And how is it that you're going to keep attaining the things that you want? That's why it's in a chapter called Of Power. One needs to increase power. Right? So the very phrase, the central phrase that all of us know from the Declaration, is the kind of deep embodiment of this ethic of releasing us from the ancient prohibitions in which to pursue one's desires and ambitions without limit is a form of enslavement, and rather to commend that should be our central activity. When Tocqueville comes to the United States in the 1830s, what does he say? He sees a remarkable country in which what he sees everywhere is restlessness, the constant desire or belief that something better may lie just around the corner. Right? That at this point, by the 1830s, we have really instantiated this kind of philosophy in our behavior, what I've come to call institutionalized discontent. Right? That's not what Winthrop was recommending, certainly, or what the Christian tradition recommended, but by the 1830s becomes a defining feature of the American landscape. And one of your favorite authors, Henry Adams, is certainly aware, seems to be the trajectory of the American Republic into the knowable future. Sir.
As I stood here, you began to answer my question. My question was, this conference, its nature is an integration of faith and learning. As I understood it, and part of the reason of my question is I wanted to make sure I understood you properly, you began to hint at Christian understandings of morality, of individualism, of a critique of autonomy, critique of greed. But unless I missed it, those notions were not as systematically well developed as your understanding of the emergence of possessive individualism in Western society. Could you give us a little better faith understanding? I mean, Ellul, for example, talks about the idolatry of technology, a phrase right out of the prophets. We could talk about the worship of money in our culture, and it would be very coherent. So could you give us a little bit about your faith understanding in light of the themes you raised, and in particular this notion of autonomy?
Well, I suppose I assume that embedded in my very brief précis of the deeper political philosophical commitments that animate our modern society, that the wellspring that makes our system work is the unleashing of self-interest. And so if I, at various points, use the language of self-interest dominantly, I think embedded in that is a conception of greed or a conception of self-serving. Right? You could say that embedded in that is the kind of notion that what was once viewed as in various forms of ancient, for the ancients, forms of viciousness, whether the ancients or the Christians, forms of vice, become the necessary wellspring or motivation for the working of the modern system. Right? This is in some ways, the very genius of the modern system. It says that all of these efforts by these ancient thinkers, right, imagining republics and principalities, in Machiavelli's words, were so much wasted time because they tried to make us into something that we're not. Right? Maybe on occasion they had some success. Those are called saints. But those are remarkable people for a reason. Right? We give feasts to them because they were so extraordinary. The rest of us aren't saints. Right? The rest of us are just driven by basic motivations and appetites of human beings. So all of this time, hundreds and hundreds of years of effort, philosophical, political, and otherwise, are devoted to trying to make us into something we're not. And so the thinkers of the early modern era say, why don't we take us as we are and try to figure out how we can devise a system that will, instead of trying to make us into something else, will harness that energy and move it in useful directions and productive directions. So one of the key works, the early works, is Bernard de Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, right? The subtitle of which is Private Vices, Public Goods. Right? He acknowledges that what is being embraced is what once was called vice, but that if properly harnessed, I think harnessing is really the key word here, right? Harnessed by a political system, harnessed by an economic system, will result in far greater productivity, far less wasted energy, and a society in which you'll have a kind of flourishing of energy, of prosperity and achievement, which I think can't be gainsaid, right? But which is fundamentally premised on a kind of unleashing of that which was seen in ancient societies, ancient philosophy and Christianity as forms of viciousness. That's That is, for all practical purposes, the essential basis on which our society is supposed to operate. And what we have now is a kind of curious palimpsest, I would call it. You know this word palimpsest? It's from the medieval era when there wasn't an awful lot of vellum. You couldn't go down to the drugstore and buy a new piece of vellum to write something. And so you'd have to erase, when you wanted to write something new, you'd have to erase the old writing. So there are scholars out there, some of you may be scholars of palimpsest here, who actually study what was erased. Right? And so in some ways what you have, it seems to me in some ways in the American Republic, is a kind of palimpsest in which we still use this language of public good, but in which the system is designed precisely to operate in certain fundamental respects in the absence and even requiring us not to act out of the public good. So it seems to be, in many ways what we have is this kind of palimpsest of appeals to an ancient sort of fragments of ancient and Christian understandings, right, in a very different kind of a system. And when we find ourselves butting up against a kind of reality that seems, in which our political system seems not to elicit in those kinds of outcomes, in which we see evidence of, great sacrifice for the sake of the public weal. Well, we're looking in some ways for the wrong result from a very different kind of a system. Sir.
Bringing it in more of an engineering technology perspective, appreciate your comments on how your thesis might change, because what I took from what you're saying is the political structure drives technology. It's always been that way. We've had this kind of dystopian fears for hundreds of years, but I would like to posit that maybe it is different this time, in this way.
It is.
Something's different this time.
Okay.
And people are picking up on this. It's kind of the Kuhnian sense that before there's a paradigm shift, there's a professional anxiety. In the books, the literature, the movies. Exhibit A would be a recent Amazon Corporation report. It said orders are up, business is up, and generally in a business cycle, you hire more people at that point. Interestingly, they didn't hire more people. And I asked my students, what do you think they did? And they'll say they bought more robots. I said, well, close. They bought an entire robot company. And the question is, and this has been backed up now by a study out of MIT called The Race Against the Machine. You can go to TED Talk, and McAfee talks about this, that the curves are changing. An historic event is happening, that in fact, as technology advances, it is a net job destroyer. So if people's marginal productivity, utility to society and economy is dropping, what does that do to this political balance that you're talking about? If people actually are worth less because of some technological trends and advancement by technology.
That people are working less because they're
actually worth. For example, we talk about the distribution of income. We limit so much concentration. Well, maybe the market is functioning efficiently. That people's labor is actually worth less. Jeremy Rifkin, the end of work theme. If it is in fact happening, what does that do to your thesis that this political shaping will come out all right in the end? That's what I took away from it. This is nothing new. Right.
Well, it's a big question, and I know time is running short. I guess there's a book by Wendell Berry called "What Are People For," and I think maybe the subtitle of that book could also be "What Is an Economy For?" It seems to me that what we have increasingly, Kurt Vonnegut predicted this in the 1960s in his wonderful book Player Piano, a wonderful book. All you guys should read this book. Put it on your list of things to read. Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut. He imagines a time when we have the capacity essentially to replace most of the workforce. Right. It's a wonderful book. The conceit of it is in part that the only people who have jobs will be people with PhDs, so everyone's a doctor, secretary, dentist, everyone who has a job is a doctor. Man, what a nightmare that would be, everyone with PhDs working. And everyone else is essentially a ward of the government. The 47%, or no, I'm just kidding. Everyone else is a ward of the government, who are basically half of whom are digging holes and the other half are filling them back in. Because there's no longer any real productive work for them to be done. The economic system and the system of production is such that you don't really need people to produce things anymore. You have machines, robotics that are able to do this. And the premise of this book, and I think the premise of Barry's book as well, is what kind of economy is it when we cease to have any useful purpose for human beings? Right? Is that an economy, or is that an idea of a human society that we ought to embrace? It may be one that's efficient, productive, profitable at a certain level, but is it good for human beings? It comes back to this question of this conference. Does this result in human flourishing? And again, we can get back to that question that animates the questions that are asked when a technology is presented, or the possibility of adopting a technology is presented to the Amish. But I think not only the Amish, is in what way will this contribute to human flourishing? And to the extent that we ask and answer that question, to what extent will this benefit me? We are incapacitated from asking that question. Right? And that's really at the heart of my talk, is that this sense of this inevitability of the direction of this technology, or the direction of our society toward a society of automation, of increasing obsolescence of human beings and human work. This sense of inevitability is itself the result of the accumulation of individual choices, all of which give us the impression or belief in our individual autonomy and liberty, but result in a kind of consequence of a felt sense, and I think not a false felt sense, of a system over which we actually have very little control. We would actually exercise more control, in a sense, if we could ask those kinds of questions that are asked by the likes of the Amish, or by Wendell Berry, or by Kurt Vonnegut. But in defining liberty down to the level of individual autonomy, we actually disempower ourselves from actually exercising a true kind of liberty. And that's at the heart of what I was trying to say tonight, and perhaps took too long to say it, is really the irony is that our definition of liberty, so defined, leads to the consequence in which we actually are deprived, in particular, of forms of civic, political, and human liberty that, it seems to me, ought to be at the heart of what it is we ought to be talking about when we talk about our various technologies, what we make. And the result of our now currently, I think, catastrophic definition of liberty is leading us to a condition in which we will end up essentially as slaves to ourselves and the things that we make. So thank you for your question.
Is it time for one more? It follows up pretty well. It's not this a rabbit trail. You point us to the irony of our choices coming back to yourself. I think it's the same problem we have with advertising, where we essentially play a blame game and say, I'm not that materialistic. Advertising made me materialistic. I think we're sort of doing the same dance with technology, trying to escape our own complicity in it. I guess my question is, rather than just greed, can we get to a theology of abundance, of diversity, of choice? I think Web 1.0 was like that. Wild, free range, nobody could corral it. Web 2.0 was 4 companies will control it, right? We don't know what Web 3.0 is going to be, but do you think there is the possibility of, we'll just call it positive choice? It's in the word flourishing itself. What do you think?
I don't know what the web or any of our technologies are going to look like. I think that to press a point that I hope I was able to make in the paper, and I think animates many of the ways in which this conference has been conceived. Technology, we're talking about, this is a big word filled with lots of implications, but we're talking about tools, right? Various kinds of tools that humans develop, and which we hope will assist in human flourishing, but which we also know, like any tool, can result in catastrophic harm to human beings. It seems to me, and by introducing with a statement that we have always been technological creatures, we've always been creatures that use techne, what it's important to point out is that our tools are used for certain purposes, and we have to be clear about what those purposes are. And if we're not clear about what those purposes are, we're likely to be in the throes or under the kind of rule of a set of assumptions that govern us, but which we haven't examined. And I think when we begin to think about counterexamples to the way that we use technology, so I use the example, various forms of insurance as a kind of technology. But let me come back to the other one, the suburbs. Right? The suburbs is a way that we've organized our built and lived environment. It's a kind of tool. A house and how we make our neighborhoods it's a way that we provide shelter for ourselves, create certain kinds of neighborhoods. But I think I know there's ample debate about this, but I do think it's becoming increasingly evident that this is a fundamentally unsustainable way of organizing our built environment. Right? I mean, it will collapse of its own accord when gas prices continue to climb, as they seem to be going always up. But before we get to that point, can we be conscious about how it is that we're using our particular tools and begin to think about how we would create a built environment that would contribute to human flourishing in ways that would take some of the benefits that people who live in the suburbs enjoy, right? But also perhaps reintroduce or introduce ways of living that are salutary and that could be increasingly embraced as forms of flourishing. These would include, to quote from my new colleague Philip Best in the Department of Architecture at Notre Dame, mixed-use neighborhoods where you're not always having to get in a car to go buy a gallon of milk. Walkable neighborhoods. Neighborhoods in which you are not so distant from neighbors that to see the next house means you have to get above the curvature of the earth to see the top of their roof. Lawns that don't require massive inputs of fertilizers that end up clogging our various watersheds, et cetera, et cetera. When we make decisions, again, based upon the criteria of individual liberty, we end up with things like suburbs. When we begin to make decisions based on how can we achieve and make the kinds of communities that will support our shared flourishing, we're going to come up with different kinds of built environments. These are all forms of technology. These are all tools we use. But the criteria we use in employing them, it seems to me, are the things that we need to spend a lot more time talking about and less time talking about how this particular technology is evil and this one is not. It's rather, what are the basic goals and ends to which our technology is being oriented? Thank you.